reproduction should be possible, then women should be willing to do, as you say in one of your footnotes, do their duty and reproduce at least 4 sons and daughters and get rewards if they produce 10. So I'm not making a question so much as just thinking about the links among the papers in terms of how you frame questions of need, right? Because there's been an awful lot of declarations about what women need. It's not this, it's not that, it's actually that. And the whole critique of Roe was they don't need that isolating privacy. Now, the thing I would like to leave with is, how much does it matter how it's framed? If you have a system that requires women to say, oh, I don't want to have a baby because I have this circumstance, and then you pay for the abortion and give her safe facilities, would that be so terrible compared to what we have here? So it's kind of like, why I think that the conclusion of your paper is sort of like in Israel, seems like a pretty high percentage of women get the abortions, right? Without having to drive 300 miles or go over to New Mexico or whatever else they do, So I'm just interested in some of those things.
Well, why are those the two options? Why are those the two options? The U.S. model or the Israeli model? Arguably, there's another alternative out there. And that, I think, is the shame of it, either to lie, to face that indignity of having to get access, or to have one's rights without access. But those seem two impoverished alternatives. And so I guess my question is there a moment to envision a third alternative and then to actually achieve it? And is there a place or circumstance where that third alternative, fourth, fifth, sixth, is realizable? But I think the extent to which we limit ourselves to one or the other becomes the problem in itself.
I also loved bringing up Marian Glyndon's work, because I've been, and this goes to Linda's I think comment, I've been fascinated with the way in which the German system is touted as this really restrictive pro-unborn life system, when in actuality it works pretty well for a significant population of women. I mean, this is a long-standing conversation some of us in this room have had, that in fact the counseling that is required of German women, it takes all manner of forms, but that it's well known what centers you go to if you want counseling light, essentially. Non-intrusive, formulaic, quick counseling. And I just add that to say that's not necessarily a perfect solution, but it does carve a path that is less about that's maybe one of your 3, 4, 5, or 6, and for me, how we get into how we decide what option we might want is a question that resonates really with politics. That resonates with what kind of society or what do we think is possible. I'm really struck by Noya's example that the abortion writing, and you see this in so many examples. Abortion writing in 1977 was in the service of a hyper-security, pro-nationalist, population control agenda. Well, so you got some abortion rights, but what did you trade by signing up for that agenda? So I just thought the comment was great, and I'm just adding my 2 cents to complicate that.
Okay, well, if I could say one thing too, your paper was so provocative because not only is there a vacuum of a court decision, but there's also a vacuum of rights. I mean, it's just amazing. And what I found myself thinking was, wait a second, if we take away the rhetoric of rights and we don't have and we don't have sort of the moderating function of courts, then we get an honest assessment of what reproductive, state regulation of reproduction is all about, and it's really about the regulation of sex and sexuality, and its borders are monitored by family law and criminal law. So, if you're married, no, we won't do that. I mean, it was really like a push and pull of women's appropriate behavior and this pronatalist approach. And I thought, is this the, it's sort of like unmasking what is behind, abortion restrictions and putting it out there for what it really is, outside, without sort of the niceties of putting this rights framing around it. Interesting.
So I have a couple of comments. First, on the one hand, relating to Linda's comments, abortions in Israel are publicly funded. Access is relatively easy. Yes, you go to the committee, you lie, the committee cooperates, everybody knows that you're lying, and you get a publicly funded abortion. And definitely, in this respect, Israeli women are in a better position compared to American women. But then you ask yourself, these are the two options. Shouldn't we hope for something else? Going back to Mary Ann Glendon's scholarship, I think that it's becoming more and more interesting as time passes because first of all, legal developments, things that happened after she wrote her two books, shed a much more nuanced light on her arguments, and many of her predictions turned out to be not to be fulfilled. For instance, one of her examples is Canada. At the time, the Canadian Supreme Court came with a decision that it declared the old British mandatory Canadian law to be unconstitutional, but then it didn't do the next step of providing a legal framework for abortion legislation, but rather handing the ball back to the legislature, saying to the Canadian Parliament, okay, now you frame the legislation. And that was back in 1988. And at the time, she argued, what a wonderful example of judicial restraint and letting, the legislature debate the issue. But unfortunately, the Canadian legislature has not been able until today to come up with a new legislation. And this has really created lots of problems. You wrote about it, right? So, yeah. No, but no. The thing is that the ones who are deciding about abortions, there's not one federal framework for abortion, but rather it's local health authorities that are making the decisions regarding abortions, and this is a source of lots of problems. There are also France just enacted a new abortion law. They got rid of the distress clause and finally embraced a rights framework for abortions. So this again sheds such a different light of what Glendon argues so passionately. Even the French realized that this is not a good framework for abortion. Glendon was really inspired by the German example, and there are many inaccuracies in the way she described the German system. I totally disagree with the way she described the legal procedures in Germany. Germany, I think, is a very interesting example of a real rights framework, a real constitutional rights framework for abortion. Very different from the American one in the sense that they recognize the fetus's right to life. And nevertheless, even when the fetus's right to life is recognized, the bottom line is a relatively very broad access and, of course, public funding to abortion. And this leads me to my final point. The problem is, if you look around and you're trying to figure out what's the problem, for instance, with the American system, the problem is not that it's a court. Abortions are the product of a court decision. The problem is the negative perception of or conceptualization of constitutional rights. If you have a negative understanding of rights, it doesn't take you anywhere. What distinguishes between the German and the American example is the German is a truly system of positive constitutional rights. And when you have a positive system of rights, so rights and need are not distinguishable, right? Because, I mean, of course, if a woman doesn't have an access to abortion, so there's no meaning to the right. So I think to remedy really the deficiency of the American system, I think the task of advocates of gender equality is to work on promoting a language of positive rights. And if this cannot be done on the federal level, on the state level, it's easier. With some states, there are big successes. And there is no other way around. I mean, giving up on rights is not the way to do it. You cannot separate between rights and reproductive justice. This is my insight.
Hi, I'm Diane Roman from France. So maybe I'd like to add some comments about the French situation, but I'm very interested in the comparison you draw about Germany and other countries. You're right, Germany has a very strong right approach, and it's very relevant to our discussion. But I think we shouldn't focus on the abortion case in Germany without having a broader approach. I mean, of course, abortion is now legal in Germany, and as you're well aware of, there are public funding hospitals who provide some abortion care, medical care. But you cannot look at the abortion medical facilities without having a broader approach. And I mean, Germany is definitively not a good example in terms of reproductive justice. It might be a good example in terms of access to abortion, but in terms of reproductive justice, there is a huge gap. For instance, women mostly have to choose between having babies, having children, or having a job. There is a very strong gap between salaries between women and men. So I think that this rights approach is particularly interesting in terms of abortion, but if you have a broader approach, well, the result and the comments may differ sensibly. And as far as France is concerned, yes, since 2014, a new law has been implemented, and now the condition of duress, détresse, has been abolished. So a woman has only to say that she doesn't want to continue her pregnancy, and she will have access to a totally legal and free medical services in terms of abortion. However, I'm not sure that abortion can be considered as a right, as a human right, within French law. And for instance, in my paper, I detailed some court decision about abortion, saying that, for instance, when an abortion fails and when there is a malpractice, the woman has to keep on the fetus and becomes a mother a few months after, well, she cannot ask for damages, and she cannot, well, the medical liability, the liability of the doctors cannot be engaged, because according to some case law, the birth of a child cannot be seen as a moral injury. And in my paper, I quote the whole court's motivation, because the judges say that the birth of a child shall not be assumed by law, causing the mother a deep affliction whose impact will continue for long after the birth. So as you can see, there might be some kind of rights enshrined in the statute law, but the courts and the judges are very reluctant to assert a real strong right who can be enforceable in court. So there is some nuance maybe here. Thank you.
I just want to say that I totally agree with you that Germany is in so many respects such a conservative and patriarchal society. And of course, if you look in the broad, as you said, on the broader spectrum of their parental policies and different, the different policies. So of course, women have to choose, and you see this reflected in declining birth rates, not only in Germany. I mean, this is really interesting about Europe. I mean, there seems to be a relationship between, I mean, the more patriarchal society is, less women give birth. Italy is another example because really women have to choose. I mean, you cannot participate in the workforce and have children because of the lack of support. But in Germany, and this is interesting, not because of gender equality, but because of other national concerns, they started now building daycares, for young children, because the policymakers are now really concerned with declining birth rates. So it's always interesting to be what promotes what appeared to be egalitarian policies.
Deborah Dinner, Emory. So thank you for a great panel. I had a few kind of suggestions/questions. So for Yvonne, you were kind of addressing that you did this more in your longer paper, but one question I had for you is how much you want to present a perfect kind of asymmetry or a perfect mirror, because by starting with Roe and saying that the abortion rights or reproductive rights movement started broad with justice and moved narrow, I think maybe it's giving a little bit too much credit to that historical moment vis-a-vis Roe itself. So I feel like there was a difference between what you were describing as the right to die movement or death with dignity as being broad and contextualized and relational still from the patient perspective versus the relational of Roe. But I know you say you address this in your larger paper more. But I thought that you don't need to portray it as a perfect symmetry in order to make the comparison. And then I just thought, in terms of thinking about a future project, and I have no real thoughts here, but just it's so generative to me to think about looking at the moment life begins and then the moment of death through a vulnerability perspective, because in some ways the vulnerability theory seems to be an existential theory about people being vulnerable throughout the life course because of the nature of what it means to be human. And so just thinking about what kinds of resources are needed at both those beginning and ending moments just seems so exciting, and I have no more further thoughts than that. But, and then I had a question for Rachel and Noya. It seems like both of you are talking about, I love seeing your papers in conjunction with each other, because you're talking about the risks of rights versus the risks of politics. So the risks of rights being the abstraction, the lack of attention to particularity, the lack of attention to implementation as opposed to rights on the books, versus when we get to the particular and the thick and the politics of it, women are being deployed for other national state interests. And in that thickness and kind of robustness of the political, you get all these kinds of compromises. So I was wondering, just is there no way out of this dilemma? I guess this is asking Joanna's question again, or are we constantly kind of shifting between these two poles, or is there some way to combine the strengths of the rights and the politics? And just as a thought, it struck me that both of you are dealing with different kind of sovereigns, like where does law come from? One from the international or from the courts versus from the legislature and the nation state. And I was really interested in this idea of turning back to women themselves as a source of authority or sovereignty. So I was thinking back to a short article I teach by Martha Minow in Law and Social Movements that says, like, well, what is law? Law can come from different kinds of authority. So I was just wondering if that's a way to start to think of a way out of this dilemma of the the strengths and weaknesses of the political versus the legalistic.
I'll start, and thank you for the observation. I'm not saying that they were moving between poles of justice and rights, but healthcare and rights. But you're right, it is not as clean. And as I said, the early abortion cases, their conceptualization of healthcare was deeply problematic, but healthcare much more so by comparison to current times. It's also the piece I pulled out for the booklet was what reproductive justice can take from, how we can think differently about healthcare more broadly because of the lessons from aid in dying and how they can sort of work together to create a broader sense of healthcare that can sort of encompass both of them. But I also discuss lessons that can be learned from the aid in dying movement, from the history of the reproductive rights movement, and this idea of conceptualizing. I write and teach in healthcare, and so I'm interested in that overlap, but narrowly conceptualizing healthcare as a doctor-patient relationship and all the things versus a broader systemic, Anyway. And I love your idea about the next paper. I'm intrigued. I like it.
Go ahead.
Thank you so much, and I really love the way that you describe the tension between our approaches and our papers, because I don't think I'm as convinced that positive rights will get us as far as we might like to go, and that's because, as you describe, I think that what falls out of view are the politics of why we have the abortion policies and the abortion laws that we have, or any number of laws or policies that are in the universe of women's reproductive health. Can we have both, or what are the intersection between the two that could be generative? That's something that I'm struggling with myself, and it's why I'm really taken with the question, does it matter if we say rights or positive duties or human rights, if what part of that language does is contesting some power structures that we really could live without, that we'd really like to change or dismantle, or, right? And I guess what I see as a way forward is to think about human rights then and rights language in those specifically political ways as movement strategies. And lots of people do this, right? Embracing their contestability, their ability to regenerate themselves, their ability to provide, political accountability. There are lots of things that rights can do that are not necessarily about courts or about the sources of authorities you name, that are about communities, that are about identities, and that could come from women, as you suggest. So I'm all for those ideas. I guess my paper is just trying to take trying to understand why that conversation doesn't happen more often.
I just want to add that ideally there shouldn't be a contradiction between the search for a common ground at the legislature and rights talk. They should come together. But unfortunately, in real life, it doesn't happen. And the more I look around, I realize that this is not a specific problem of the Israeli parliament, at a specific period of time. This seems to be a much broader problem, and I'll go back to the example of Canada again. Since the Supreme Court in Canada stopped short of outlining a specific framework for abortion legislation, so there's no limit whatsoever today on abortion in Canada, right? There's no gestation limitation. I mean, theoretically, you can perform an abortion at the 40th week of the pregnancy. But of course, this doesn't happen. What happens is that local health authorities, either family doctors or other hospitals and other decision makers who should not be in this position to make this decision, right? This is a rights decision, right? And you wouldn't want, local authorities making these decisions with big differences between one province to another, right? That one province decides that gestation limitations comes at the 12th week of pregnancy, and in Ontario, for instance, where I live now, so it's you can perform an abortion until 24th or 20th weeks of the pregnancy. So it seems to me that as a practical matter, courts are in a better position to make tough rights decisions. And legislators, due to the complex, political, situation, legislators are often betray their duty, I don't know, to act within the boundaries of, constitutional rights. It just doesn't happen. But of course, that would be the ideal case.
I might just take this and pass this.
So one thing that I want to just question is whether or not rights and courts need go together. Because that's been a lot of the talk, is somehow rights are the domain of the judiciary, which is in fact untrue, right? And so if you want to use Canada as an example, one of the strongest groups who have been articulating rights in the abortion context in recent times have been legislatures. I mean, in Prince Edward Island, it was the premier who came out and who said, we must change policy because our current policy is inconsistent with the rights of women. And so somehow the rights talk came into local political discourse in a way. And I think that that's incredibly important for us to start to think about, what do rights look like that are outside of a very legal form? And can they be some kind of collective political understanding of rights that admit to living with others and difference in a political community? And so to that end, I think maybe if there's a contradiction on the panel or some tension, for me it would be between Noya and Yvonne's pieces. Personally, I think the death of politics and abortion came with medicalization and making abortion synonymous with access to health care. That is when you depoliticized abortion in a very problematic way, when you made it a question of caring, interpersonal relationships, how one person deals with their own family and ideas about themselves. I mean, it is fascinating if you look at the history of abortion counseling, for example. In the 70s, when women's rights groups were doing a lot of the counseling in abortion clinics, these were acts of political consciousness raising. This was the idea of saying, this is not your personal circumstance, the way in which you feel ready or not ready to raise a family, whether or not you think you are or are not right to be a parent, that there were many aspects of one's social and economic life that dictated that. And it was the idea of making it depersonal and making it political that mattered. And now when you look at so many abortion clinics, they are healthcare facilities. And that counseling method is a pure informed consent model. And I think in dangerous ways, if you look at the discourse that a lot of that counseling is using, it's using this individual empowerment model. I'm going to terminate my pregnancy. I'm going to be very empowered by that decision. I'm making what's right for me and my family, taking no account of the social conditions that leave you with only that choice. And then for you to adopt that choice as your own and to be proud of it, wow, What a political move. What a wonderful political move to make people accept the own conditions of their impoverished condition and then to wave them as the flag of empowerment. That is what is so dangerous, I think, about moving into medical models and moving into, quote, caring versus politicized models.
Well, I have a few questions, but I thought what I could do is ask them and then just pause for a second to introduce our dean, Jeremy Paul, so that you can welcome everybody and go back to the reception. Oh, okay. So my questions are primarily for Joanna and Rachel, but first, thanks to all of you for getting us started in such an exciting way. It's awesome. My question for Joanna, and these are a little bit more specific substantively to your papers, but my question for Joanna is, about the way you're positioning the family planning. I'm just curious about how you're thinking about this, the family planning movement versus the sort of broader structural inequality questions that you're trying to ask in your paper. And one question might be, is the family planning, is the family planning movement sort of an epiphenomenon of structural inequality? Is it part of the problem? You kind of alluded to that at the end when you talked about the private donors. So is family planning a part and parcel of the problematic development apparatus that we have that leads to this kind of structural inequality that you want us to be talking about a little bit more? And then my question for Joanna and Rachel was something that I think about a lot in my own work and struggle with, which is, how much agency do you want to ascribe to the feminists or the family planning activists or the people in your story? Like, are feminists sort of bystanders to neoliberalism and sort of the downsides of human rights and sucked up into that entire apparatus and struggle with sort of being limited by the discourse, or are they perpetuating it, agents inside of it, sort of making the case for it, if that makes sense? So I'm just wondering how you're thinking about agency, the agency of the actors themselves in these movements and in these, and perhaps Joanna, in your story, it's more than the feminists and the reproductive justice people. It would be the development people. It would be the experts. It would be the feminist experts. The whole gamut. And then for Yvonne, I was just wondering if you might parse a little bit more the distinction between the right to die frame, and I feel like your presentation was in part a lot about this, and I couldn't quite grasp, and the palliative care piece of this, because in my HIV/AIDS, my experience with the HIV/AIDS world, the palliative care people are often the church people, but the right to die people aren't often the religious people, and there seems to be a continuum, but also sort of the players might be different depending on which part of the continuum you're on. But let me just stop there also to introduce our dean, Jeremy Paul, who wanted to welcome all of you, and we're so grateful to have Jeremy because for many reasons, but also because his mom was a lawyer for Planned Parenthood for many years, and it means we have someone who really supports all our great work here. And thank you, Jeremy, for always doing that.
I'm very comfortable with women lawyers. It's fantastic that you're here. I want to thank Aziza for all the work you did in putting this together. And Stu, I hear you're a visiting scholar here now, so we love that. And Martha Feynman I've known for like 30 years, but I guess it's too bad that she wasn't able to come. But anyway, in addition to my mom's service on Planned Parenthood, I was on the board of Planned Parenthood in Florida when I was on the faculty there, in Connecticut for 10 years when I was on the faculty there. And I think this is a just absolutely crucial issue. I can't believe, I have to be honest with you, where we are in this country right now on these issues. I mean, if you told me 15 years ago that we'd be going backwards in a lot of states. And what is it, Oklahoma just passed a flagrantly unconstitutional statute. I mean, what are they even thinking? When you meet, I think, a lot of younger women, well, of course, you're all younger than I am, but they don't sort of remember what it was like, how bad things used to be. And it looks as though we have to have this fight all over again, which is unfortunate. But I'm sure all of you will be leading the charge, and we appreciate it. And thank you very much for coming and spending a couple days with us. And I'm sure it'll be a great conference. We have another conference going on right now at the same time, which is the Northeastern is the co-host of the Journal of Legal Education. And so we've sponsored a conference with them on the future of legal scholarship. And there's a joint reception, so the more you listen to me, the less food you're getting. So I think I'm going to shut up. But I hope that you'll all have time to come down and join us at the reception. And thanks so much.
I'll be very brief because I'm between you and a glass of wine or a plate of cheese. So I think about I love cheese. So I think about Aziz's question all the time, how much agency, and I constantly challenge myself to say feminist, or feminisms or feminist ideas and not feminists, the advocates, the people, because what I'm really interested in is mapping how these ideas circulate and what becomes common sense to us in movements. And that isn't just about advocates. Advocates are complicated. People are complicated. We act as advocates with complex and nuanced motivations. And so it's a nice reminder to include that and to be explicit about it, both in the paper and when I talk about the paper.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely true. And also how labels and the content have changed, such that who feminists were in the 70s are not the same who feminists are today, right? And there are shifting political and theories and understandings that underlie those labels. Who are your population actors or your development actors? They're operating very differently today, and many of them entirely use a human rights discourse inside their work. And yet their human rights are different than other human rights actors. And so I think that idea of understanding the plurality that comes with any of these labels is critical to doing the work now. And I think the other piece is this kind of, and a lot of our work, I think especially our work shares, the idea of trying to put many thousand pieces together into something. Because in each one of these moments, I think there's incredible work to reduce suffering, to address harm, to do very productive, good work that meets people's needs. But when you start to put it together and you understand the rhetoric that moves with it, the discourses, the larger frames into which it's feeding, that's when you start to see patterns and consequences of a long term. And I think that's part of what is fascinating about this work and taking this kind of frames modeling where you start to put very concrete actions into larger contexts and words that are spoken that are kind of benevolent in those moments, that maybe even are in some ways, they don't really have any significance in that space, but they're only as set against historical or other social conditions that they become resonant in a very particular way.
So I agree that there is a distinction between the right to die movement and then these sort of grassroots movements that were sort of coming along at the same time, and palliative care is definitely one of them. They're not sort of part and parcel. They're moving in waves, and they are coalescing around an idea of enhancing patient support. But it also, I address palliative care and as the many instances that broadening goals to social justice goals beyond narrow constitutional rights framings offers the opportunity for coalition building in a way that is unusual and surprising. And palliative care would be a great example. There's lots of examples of religious organizations having an interesting overlap with, for example, the Maximum Family Grant. It is both a reproductive justice question, but it's also a question that the Catholic organizations are very engaged in for different reasons, but it makes for interesting overlaps. And I think palliative care and enhancing social support in order to, once rights are foreclosed, it allows you to sort of think of other ways in which to achieve goals that are broader than just decision-making at death.
I hate to draw this to a close. However, we will go down to the reception and continue these fantastic conversations over wine and delicious, delicious cheese. And then I'll ask you all to stay behind for dinner, because we have dinner just for the VHC participants, so please do not go anywhere, because a big part of these workshop weekends is also breaking bread together. So we'll sit and we'll continue these conversations and get prepared for tomorrow. So I look forward to seeing you all over the rim of my glass in a few moments downstairs. Thank you. And thank you so much to the panelists. And